Hi, so this is James, aka JP Harker, coming to you with another video, and it's another bit of patriotism here because it is Owain Glyndwr, the story of the last Prince of Wales by Terry Brereton. This is it. The fact that I have these 3 pages full of notes made during it, don't worry, I'm going to go through all of them, is a sign of just how much there is in this book. And it's not just political flag waving, it is good, solid content. I will read to you a quick comment about the idea of nationalism. We'll start, which is cultural nationalism is an awareness of and pride in one's heritage, not a desire to invade Poland or kick off another world war. And I think, yes, there is always a danger when one hears the word nationalism to think that it's almost a synonym for fascism, because so often it is. And I think it was Macron who said that nationalism was the antithesis of patriotism, because patriotism is the belief that your country is more morally sound than anybody else's, and nationalism is proving that wrong by showing that you're selfish. So that's an interesting notion. But in Wales, nationalism is often fairly left-wing, and it is, as we find here, cultural nationalism, an idea of pride in where we came from rather than a superiority and a need to get rid of other people. Don't worry, I won't bang on about the politics of it. And I'm only going to read 2 more quotes from the book itself, because having just vilified extreme nationalism, I am going to throw in some patriotism here. Cumbrian Bith. On the subject of the Welsh, Henry II once wrote to the Emperor of Constantinople saying, "In a certain part of the island there was a people called the Welsh, so bold and ferocious that, when unarmed, they did not fear to encounter an armed force, being ready to shed their blood in defence of their country and to sacrifice their lives for renown, which is the more surprising, as the beasts of the field over the whole face of the island became gentle, but these desperate men could not be tamed." I rather like that. Tacitus said something awfully similar about the Silures, as something like neither kindness nor cruelty could tame them. I rather like that. For a country that largely lives under the thumb of the English, it's nice to have a little bit of, there we go. I won't give you Giraldus's quote as well, because it's largely the same thing. You know, go Wales, they keep fighting even though they'll definitely lose. And that should really be our national motto, you know, it's keep fighting. Can we win? No! Yeah, we should put that instead of Ich Dyn on the printer's arms. But anyway, Owain Glyndwr. If you're Welsh, you've definitely heard of him. If you're not, you probably haven't. Even though Che Guevara had heard of him and described him as the first guerrilla fighter. But if you're not Welsh, you probably haven't heard of him, which is rather unfair given how much he achieved. And it's mentioned in this book, had he been English or French, he'd have been fairly well known throughout Europe. But because he was part of this very small nation, and spoiler alert, because eventually the rebellion failed, it's all been covered up. It's common knowledge that things like bards were forbidden from singing about him, or for singing about good things in Wales generally. So it is unfortunate, because he was a remarkable man. Now, the first thing people with a vague idea of him will say is, he only got involved for his own good, because it did all start off with a land dispute. But I'll keep the history fairly simple. It started off because the King of England at this time, Henry IV, had usurped the throne from his predecessor, Richard II. And Owain had been one of the people on Richard's team. They weren't on intimate terms, but he was a part of that faction. And when Henry took over, that faction still existed as a grumbling, semi-resistant group. And so Henry very stupidly just thought, well, I'll persecute these people. He didn't really learn from men like Glyndwr and Mortimer and Hotspur and Douglas, who all very early on thought, you know how we're enemies? You know how maybe we shouldn't be and we'll be all right? That's not how Henry thought, it would seem. Henry thought, let's crush things. And while he did eventually win over, and well, his son rather, managed to get Wales into the fold, it cost him so much, including his health, and he spent his whole reign desperately trying to cling on to power that would so easily have been fixed if he'd been a little bit cleverer and a little bit less, no, slap him, which is what his attitude was. An interesting little note on that is the King of France refused to acknowledge Henry as King of England at all, and in letters wrote him as the man calling himself the King of England. That's by the by. I'd like to do sort of a proper deep video about Glyndwr, but to what extent that would interest people, I don't know, and I am here mainly to say of this book. This book sums up the rising and the eventual downfall very, very well. It puts it into context very well, because the temptation is to speak mostly about only what Glyndwr does, rather than what was happening that made him do what he did. So we have things like the letters he was writing to the French king and the letters he was writing to the Scottish king. This wasn't just the Welsh rising up, this was an attempt to completely change the map. A treaty he'd made with Edmund Mortimer, who was Richard II's actual heir that Henry was shoving aside. He made deals with Edmund Mortimer, he made deals with Harry Hotspur, who was from Northumberland. Two people who were ostensibly on the English side, but that Henry managed to alienate and that Glyndwr managed to make friends of. They'd planned to completely break up the notion of what the Kingdom of England was, with Mortimer taking the south and east, and the Harry Hotspur, the Percy's family taking the north bit, and the Welsh getting their independence. It was a huge enterprise, not just a single rising and a single attempt for independence. There was a lot going on. And if it weren't for a few little factors, I think one of the worst ones was Glyndwr couldn't make it to the Battle of Shrewsbury because the Severn had flooded, ironically. Things might really have been very different. There we go. We have little things like the legends about him being able to control the weather, which made it into the Shakespeare play, because the English kept blaming the Welsh weather for why they kept failing. We have the interesting little concept that did he die? Did he vanish into exile? Did he disguise himself as a priest in his daughter's household and just live there for the rest of his life? Because the truth is, we don't really know what happened after the uprising rose and fell. Glyndwr vanishes from history, and no one knows what happened. And we will probably never know. But it's probably a good thing, because it's given him this sort of Arthurian status. And for the record, if Arthur was anything, he was Welsh. He was a Briton. And right up to the medieval time, the English were referring to the Welsh as the Britons, because there wasn't a British identity. The English knew that they were this Anglo-Norman people, not native to Britain people. So Arthur is one of ours, but the English like to claim he's one of theirs. But just in case of that, we have our backup Arthur, who also disappeared mysteriously after being a very successful warrior ruler. And maybe one day he'll come back again to free us and all of that. And so I rather like that. I really do. I'll quickly answer, by the way, why is he called a prince? Why isn't he a king? And it's because in Wales we had small kingdoms, and the one in charge of all of them was Princeps Rexus, which is the principal king. And that's how Llywelyn started it, and that's why we've only really had prince here. It's the same linguistic root as prince being sort of an heir to a throne, but it's not the same thing. It's like in Eastern Europe and Italy, the old Holy Roman Empire, they use prince and it just means principal. So it annoys me when people are like, oh, Wales, it's just a principality. No, we just use Latin differently, genius. Sorry, stop slapping down the English, Jim. You have English family. It's not fair. So I'm not going to go on a patriotic rant and I'm not going into a historical deep dive, but Owain Glyndwr is a very interesting historical character, and this is a very good book about him. It shows how he rose into prominence. It shows how he spent so many years dropping around different parts of Wales, sometimes by force, sometimes by inspiration, getting people on side and onto the concept of these anti-Welsh laws aren't fair, these English are oppressing us, we need to do something. And the many clever things he did, because people like to talk about courage, he was a clever man, fighting a guerrilla war, fighting a political war. It was a clever way of doing things, and it damn near succeeded. And the details of that, and of one of my favourite historical characters, Harry Hotspur, and a little bit about Prince Hal, who will eventually become Henry V. It's all in here. It's concise, but it's detailed. It's easy to read. It's engaging. Can thoroughly recommend. I have got another book on Owain that I will be looking at fairly soon, but this is a really good place to start. If you want to have a look at medieval history, or specifically medieval Welsh history, pick this up. It's Terry Breverton, and it's Owain Glyndwr, the story of the last Prince of Wales. I've rambled a little bit because I just have so many notes to go through that I wanted to shine detail on, and I'm just not going to because that would be too much for one video. I will leave it there. Owain Glyndwr, Cymru am byth. I shall leave it at that then. This is James, aka JP Harker. Hwyl fawr.